I was about to go to bed, and then this happened. AMD has kind of shadow dropped. There was a little bit of a teaser this morning. FSR Ray Regeneration. Now, this is part of the Fsr Redstone that AMD promised a second half of 2025 launch for, and I'm hoping we still get the full thing, because again, a reminder that this is just one piece of Fsr Redstone. So to be clear, the full Fsr Redstone does include Ray Regeneration, which says that infers and restores full quality ray trace detail from sparse samples, delivering sharp, noise-free visuals with reduced rendering cost. In other words, Ray Regeneration is a machine learning based denoiser for ray traced upscaling, similar to NVIDIA's ray reconstruction, at least as it's been described. In this video, we can now finally actually test it out. But again, the rest of FSR Redstone would include FSR upscaling, which we do have FSR 4, and it's unclear if they mean that there's going to be some additional update to it beyond that. Now, there is an interesting thing on that note, though, because note that when I select Ray Tracing Denoiser FSR Ray Regeneration, look at this tooltip here. It says FSR Ray Regeneration denoises ray traced inputs using a machine learning based algorithm. It is recommended to be used in conjunction with FSR 4 or newer. Now that's interesting. Now that could just be kind of placeholder text to account for the fact that there will likely be future updates to FSR. Maybe, 4.1, 4.2, maybe there'll be an FSR 5 at some point. So this could just be meaningless placeholder text. But that is just, I think, interesting to note that, potentially FSR Redstone could come with some additional updates to the actual upscaling algorithm itself. Now, keep in mind, they're also promising a frame generation, which is going to be machine learning based, as opposed to, I think, their current one, which I think is more of a just algorithmic one. And then they're also promising FSR radiance caching, which dynamically learns and then predicts how light propagates through a scene, delivering efficient real-time global illumination. So in other words, kind of, it's neural radiance caching. Anyway, so today is not the full release of FSR Redstone, but we are getting access to the Ray Regeneration denoiser. So how are we going to test it out in this video? So I have plugged in my 9070 XT, and the plan is, this Call of Duty game has a built-in benchmark, so the first thing we're going to want to test out is the performance difference between having Ray Regeneration being used and having the default denoiser enabled in the game, which would be, just whatever they would have been using other than this Ray Regeneration. Because one thing we want to test for is performance difference. Because as we've seen with like Ray Reconstruction from NVIDIA, in some games that have a lot of denoising happening, the Ray Reconstruction can actually gain performance compared to the default denoiser. Whereas in other games where the default denoiser is not quite as heavy, then sometimes Ray Reconstruction is actually slower. And also with NVIDIA, it can depend on which GPU you're using and how fast its acceleration for it is. So older generations like the 20 series can be a bit slower than the newer generations like the 50 series. So this will be interesting to try out here. Anyway, so yeah, we need to get some benchmarks with this on and off, and I think at a variety of resolutions would make sense as well here. So I think this will be most interesting in side-by-sides. So I'm gonna stop recording for a second, capture some side-by-side footage, get it side-by-side, and then we'll look at that together. Then we'll see if any additional testing seems necessary or useful. Okay, so I have some benchmarks captured. Again, this is on the 9070 XT. I've done some testing at 4K, 1440p, and 1080p. On all of the tests, I've chose the Extreme Graphics preset. That's the highest graphics preset in the game, and set the ray tracing as high as possible. The game seems to have ray traced reflections. That's the only RT effect, and I've set it to high. Again, I'm not choosing these settings because I think this is how most people would play this game. I mean, maybe the campaign, but because we're testing out ray regeneration here, right? So that's why I'm turning everything up, especially the ray tracing. But on the 4K output, I'm using FSR performance mode, and I am using FSR 4. And then on the 1440p output, I'm using the balanced upscaling. And on the 1080p output, I'm using the quality level upscaling. I selected those because those are generally the modes I would actually use on a 9070 XT on those types of displays. Anyway, so I've got the side by side. We have the default denoiser on the left. We've got ray regeneration on the right, but you can also monitor some performance numbers up here. Now, the one in the middle is going to be the average frame rate. The one on the left is the frame rate at that time, and the one on the right is the 1% lows. So we're going to be looking for two things. We're checking, is ray regeneration noticeably faster or slower than the default denoiser? And then we're also going to check for visual differences. It's also important to note that we are just testing in one game against the default denoiser in this particular game. So measuring ray regeneration against other denoisers could have different differences in performance and in image quality. With that being said, I'm going to shrink myself down tiny, so I'm kind of out of the way here from the image quality perspective. And let's start kind of inching through the frames here, because no, that's not how you play a game, but we're trying to look for differences in a subtle graphical technology, right? That's what we're looking for here. So I'm especially going to want to be looking for ray traced reflections and checking the quality of those reflections. We'll get to a swimming pool here in just a second. And let's pause here and take a look. So I can definitely see a difference in the reflections. Let's let it continue playing and see if it holds up. Yeah, would you guys agree that the water on the right-hand side here is looking noticeably more detailed and sharper in the reconstruction of that reflection? I don't think I'm just imagining things, kind of going forward and backward here again to get a look at it a few times. But yeah, to me, this is looking noticeably sharper on the right-hand side. So I would say that that's a good look for the ray regeneration, at least in this particular scene. Okay, let's go ahead and play it a little more live speed here for a bit and kind of see how that goes. Do note that if you're seeing screen tearing, I'm not capturing at 60 FPS. I'm capturing at 60 FPS, but the gameplay is not VSync locked because I do want to measure performance differences. And with that in mind, let's pause here for a second and take a look at the performance differences. So right now we're seeing in this exact moment 49 FPS on both sides of the screen, but the averages right now are starting to accumulate a small difference. 58 FPS with the default denoiser, 56 FPS with ray regeneration. So it is looking like there's a little bit of additional performance cost compared to the default denoiser, but it doesn't appear to be an extreme difference. Now, I don't see, like if we just pause on a random scene that doesn't seem to have a lot of reflections, I don't know, are you guys seeing any major difference here? Remember, if you're on mobile, you can pinch to zoom. You can also, step through the individual frames on desktop. I think you use the little left, right arrow keys on like your period and comma buttons. But I can frame by frame here. But I don't know, is the right side slightly sharper or is that a placebo effect? I don't know. So maybe a little bit sharper on the overall image, but okay. As soon as we got some reflections in the floor tiles here, I feel like I'm seeing a lot more detail in the floor tiles on the right-hand side of the screen. And I'll move a few frames to make sure it's not just getting a bad frame on the left-hand side. But yeah, I'm seeing a major difference. Look at the detail of this reflection right here and this reflection right here. Definitely some pretty major detail differences in those reflections. So once again, that looks like a pretty big win for the ray regeneration denoiser here compared to the default. Now again, playing at live speed, not like super noticeable, but when you pause things, it is noticeable. We're getting another reflection here on the floor, and I'm once again noticing more crisp detail. Like, do you see that this line here is being reflected much more clearly in the water reflection? Here you can see the lines reflected, but it's just not quite as sharp, not as much detail there. So yeah, this is once again looking to be a bit of a win for the ray regeneration denoiser. Again, let's move a little bit more at kind of live speed. So again, in full gameplay in a fast-paced multiplayer game, yeah, maybe we're not going to, be turning on all the bells and whistles, might not even have RT reflections on anyway for performance reasons in this particular game. But again, we're measuring the ray regeneration technology, and it is looking like we're seeing some noticeable wins here. So we can see some more reflections on the windows here. I'm not sure I'm seeing as much of a difference here as I was seeing in the other scenes. Again, maybe you guys will spot things I don't. I was never super good at those, like, spot the difference little pages, you know. But some of these are pretty obvious. Okay, I'm interested in how this explosion compares on the water here. So let's go ahead and take a look. Okay, so as that effect kind of ripples across the water, both of them can look a little bit odd. And maybe the explosion's not exactly identical between the two screens either. So maybe there can be some differences in those effects. It certainly looks different on the left and the right. I'm not sure I'm seeing one that seems significantly better than the other on that. They definitely looked a bit different. Like I said, there could also potentially be some difference between the just how that explosion plays out, even though we're getting as close to perfect side-by-side as we can by using the built-in benchmark tool. Notice we've now switched to 1440p. It's still extreme settings RT high, but and now it's FSR balanced mode rather than performance, and going for a 1440p output rather than the 4K output. Although I think actually let's step back to the 4K for a second, performance difference-wise. Looked like we ended up with 59 FPS on the left versus 56 on the right. Average, so we lost 3 FPS. We're talking around, it's a less than a 10% performance drop. And then the 1% lows are off by 1. So yeah, ray regeneration was a little bit heavier performance-wise, but certainly not significant. 3 FPS out of a 59 base. All right, let's go into the 1440p test here. And again, not seeing massive differences on scenes like this. I'm looking to see if I can see any difference in stuff that isn't reflections. Like, are we getting more detail in the trees in the distance or anything? I don't know, maybe. It's hard to say. If there's anything, it doesn't seem super obvious even when standing still. Okay, but let's check it out at 1440p. At 4K, I noticed some differences here. I feel like I'm still seeing it at 1440p. Would you guys agree the water reflections on the right appear to be noticeably more detailed here, with the tree reflecting in the water nicely, and this looking just a little bit more kind of fuzzy on the details on that side of the screen? So, and again, I can kind of play it at full speed. We could go, inching frame by frame, but it seems like so far things are looking similar to what we saw on the 4K results. So again, when it's not reflections on screen, I feel like I'm not necessarily seeing any super noticeable differences here. Yeah, so it certainly seems to be when the reflections are on the screen that we're getting more obvious differences. Again, if we back up here, let's get a look at this, floor reflection. And once again, similar to what we saw at 4K, I feel like we're getting much sharper reflection of this right here than what we're seeing here. Although, interestingly, I almost feel like I get more detail on this left-hand one on this 1440p output than we did at the 4K. Maybe I'm wrong. But I still, comparing the two, feels like we definitely have better detail on the right-hand side of the screen than we do on the left. So yeah, let's go ahead and keep playing it. Seeming like we're seeing similar results, though, to what we saw at 4K. Again, I could go back to this puddle reflection that we had here if we want to kind of step-by-step back here. And let's kind of move forward a little bit. Yeah, I think it's still looking like sharper edges and things on the right-hand side. Interestingly, I feel like we might be losing a little, when we're actually looking at this line reflection here. Again, notice screen tearing is just from being out of sync capture with the gameplay frame rate. But when I'm looking at this reflection, that looks, I think, sharper on the right than it does on the left. Whereas are we getting a little bit more of this line here on the left now, and maybe a little bit less here? Although it should be a thinner line, so Anyway, I felt like on the 4K, it looked like a more distinct difference between the two. Now, keep in mind that this is balance mode upscaling rather than performance mode now. So maybe the default denoiser is closer to the full rendering resolution than we were on the 4K results. So maybe that's also impacting how large of differences we see. Again, there's some puddles here. There's not enough being reflected for me to say that I'm seeing some huge difference in the puddles right now. Then again, we will get the explosion on the water. Actually, let me go back for a second. Did it seem a little bit more kind of sparkly and ripply on the water on the right-hand side right now as we move forward? I'm looking kind of at the water up here as we move forward and comparing them. I almost felt like I saw a little bit more ripply noise as we moved forward on this. On the right-hand side, but maybe that's just a coincidence. Maybe more detail on the right, but the left-hand side just seemed more cohesive slightly on that motion. I don't know, because again, with the different denoisers, it's not always going to be positives when there's differences necessarily. There could be negatives. So, okay, let's take a look at the explosion on this and kind of frame by frame on it. I'm not seeing crazy differences here. It does look different, though, between the two. Right here, it looks noisier on the left, wouldn't you say? But again, maybe the explosion just looks a little bit different overall. You can see like the glass broke slightly differently on both sides. So yeah, it looks like there could just be some differences in how the explosion plays out between benchmark runs. Okay, performance-wise, let me back up for a second. It was 88 FPS on the left, 87 on the right. So that can just be run-to-run variance or showing just a very slight performance degradation on the right. So it's looking like at the lower output resolution, we were not seeing as big of a performance differential. Again, and it was the balance mode upscaling rather than performance. So again, that seems to maybe have relieved a little bit of the burden. Now let's go ahead and look. We're now looking at 1080p output, still extreme settings RT high, and we've switched to FSR quality. So the least aggressive upscale here, but we're also looking at the lowest, native rendering resolution. Again, I think the reflection does clearly look better on the right-hand side of the screen between these. I think I'll probably let this one play until we hit, maybe those floor reflections, etc. Remember, you can always pause and kind of step by step through all this. Performance looks a few FPS lower on the right, but no major differences. And okay, how about we back up here, look at the floor reflections again. Yeah, I still feel like we're getting crisper detail with the ray regeneration here. Like these lines being reflected here certainly look a little bit less kind of hazy and wide than what we're seeing here. It just seems a little bit more defined, a little bit more sharp on the right-hand side of the screen. So that does still seem to be the case on the 1080p with FSR quality. And again, probably just let it play here. Yeah, performance seems barely different. Again, we could look at these reflections. I think I'm seeing similar characteristics to what we saw at the other resolutions, where it is, it looks a little bit sharper edges on the right-hand side of the screen. So yeah, it seems to be doing a good job there. And the overall performance here, we're looking at a 2 FPS difference. So ray regeneration slightly heavier now. We dropped down to 1, now back to 2, now back to 1. So yeah, and we're talking at a 100 FPS baseline. So we're talking like a 1 to 2% performance difference at these settings. So that's the testing that I've got for you guys today. I would love to do a bunch more, but it's really late. This game is a midnight launch, at least East Coast time. And so I have to teach in the morning. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you found it useful and or interesting. This is also not a comparison against ray reconstruction. I haven't looked to see if I plugged in an NVIDIA GPU, if we would get ray reconstruction here. And then there would also be the difference between the FSR4 upscaling versus DLSS upscaling anyway. So really that would turn into a more complicated thing. But overall thoughts from what we saw here. The performance cost compared to this particular default denoiser in this particular game didn't seem to be major, although it was measurable. It didn't seem to be enough of a problem to stop you from using it, given that it does, from what I can see here, have image quality benefits overall. The ray traced reflections looked better. Like I said, it would be interesting to explore this in other games. Hopefully it comes to other games quickly. That's going to be another thing. I'd love to see it in Cyberpunk in the path tracing mode. Compare it with DLSS and ray reconstruction more directly. All sorts of things I'd love to see. How does it perform on the weaker, like 9060 XT cards instead of the 9070 XT? There's a bunch more things that we could explore. Also, I want to see this in a game that is not just RT reflections. What about RTGI, RT shadows, a full-on path tracing game? So there's so much that needs to still be proved here. But from what we're able to test in this first initial look, it certainly does seem to improve the ray traced reflections without a major performance cost compared to this particular denoiser. So in that case, I'm overall positive about what we've seen here. Let me know what you guys saw in the comment section, and hope all of you have an excellent day.